I wish kids' TV were more ambitious these days, more spontaneous with the stories it pushes to present. But perhaps that's one wish no amount of magic can grant. As the genre as a whole has grappled with an ever-widening chasm of viewing options and continued challenges concerning ratings and viability, media for young audiences has been willed to ever fewer, ever safer options, assuming executives don't just see no value beyond the balance sheet and pull the plug entirely. And despite the fact that we're now over a decade into this age of reboots, we've now arrived at perhaps the biggest example of creative cowardice designed by committee. After all the rehashes we've seen, perhaps this one, on its surface at least, is the most blatantly devoid of purpose and substance. The Fairly OddParents, A New Wish, Nickelodeon's latest cartoon premiere, has a lot of odds stacked against it, as the newest iteration of a franchise which has had a torturous history with spin-offs and rehashes already. But can this show find its own way to justify why it exists? I'm Ben C. Johnson Jr., I'm enthusiastic about television, and I'll believe it when I see it. Where do I begin with the big, messy history of the Fairly OddParents, as a series and as a franchise? The longest running of the shows created by Butch Hartman, The Fairly OddParents, originally was a cartoon that ran from 2004 until 2017 about a neglected young boy who receives fairy godparents that can grant him almost any wish he desires. Back during most of its run, it was the second most popular show on the network, after SpongeBob, of course, and was treated well and given plentiful scheduling. Much like the way The Loud House, the ultimate successor to its second fill of throne, was treated by the network in its early seasons. But while the show was well loved in its prime, it's more notable among kids' TV followers now for the many ways it seemed to jump the shark in its later years, throwing just about everything possible at the wall in a way that twisted the core premise unrecognizably. The introduction of Cosmo and Wanda's baby, Poof, in Season 6 back in 2008 garnered little derisive sentiment, but just about every other introduction this show made in the back half of its run did. 3 live-action Fairly OddParents movies, starring Drake Bell as a 20-something Timmy trying not to grow up, have not aged well. The introduction of magical dog Sparky in Season 9 and the cramming in of Chloe Carmichael, a new neighbor Timmy has to share his fairies with, in Season 10, are most associated with the series' creative decline, with additional interactions between the fairies and the show's adult characters, who originally aren't supposed to know they exist, further setting the show off the rails. The show's 10th season would be its last, with the final 11 episodes being sent to a burn-off on Nicktoons in early 2017, usually a fate reserved for lesser, or newer, successes. Most of the episodes would get an even quicker burning run on the main channel in April 2018. In February 2018, Hartman announced he had left Nickelodeon after 20 years and 4 series with them. Hartman would proceed to set his so-so reputation on fire over the next few years, with his first post-Nick project in summer 2018 being the development of Oaxis Entertainment, a family-friendly streaming service, later bid and switched into a Christian-themed offering as well, until that received backlash from fans and backers. His boastful gloat, "I created your childhood," would become a mocking cry for the dumpster fire his career after Nickelodeon became. Oaxis would fizzle out as a broken mess of a website stuffed with low-quality third-party sludge, and his next project, web series Hobby Kids Adventures, based on a YouTube channel, was nothing to write home about either. He'd finally get a Christian cartoon under his belt, preschool series The Garden, in 2023, but it's clear that his time after Nick wasn't working out. Meanwhile, Nick was doing just fine without him, at least until recently. See some of my other videos for that coverage. But perhaps out of desperation, or at least a desire for a stable paycheck in a way faith-based scripting and possibly plagiarized definitely off-model commissions couldn't do for him, Hartman came crawling back to Nick in 2021, where a sequel rehash of his most successful concept was put into development. The Fairly OddParents, Fairly Odder, running for 13 episodes on Paramount Plus in March 2022, then dragged out on Nick over the ensuing year to middling ratings before being removed from the streamer entirely in January 2023, whereabouts or write-off unknown, saw the fairies passed off to Timmy's cousin and her new stepbrother as he left for college. Never mind that breaks the live-action movie's place in the continuity, as much as a consistent plotline still matters to this franchise. In the ensuing 7 years since the end of the original series, and honestly, the ensuing decade since Season 9's premiere, where most agree it really started to go downhill, the Fairly OddParents reputation has become one of a show that outstayed its welcome and overplayed its hand, speak nothing of the sour image of the show's creator that has been built in that time. And that is the environment in which word of a spinoff first came out back in 2023, with trademark filings of the spinoff's title and a series of leaks of internal Nickelodeon media giving a first look at the show's tone and style. Why, after the reputation Fairly has since garnered, and especially after the disaster of a spinoff in recent memory, was Nick trying yet again to make this work? Was Butch that desperate for money? After canceling and trashing their last slate, was Nick out of ideas? Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle and they actually deserve each other. Whatever the story is, The Fairly OddParents: A New Wish was officially announced on February 23rd, 2024 and premiered on May 20th, this time applying the hijinks that ensued to 10-year-old Hazel, who's feeling unsure of herself after some big life changes, as her brother heads to college and the family moves to the big city. Cosmo and Wanda come out of a long retirement to help her out. At this point, the premises and concepts behind these redredgings of the Fairly franchise are starting to go in circles. We've done the base concept itself before, twice. We've done a female lead before, thanks to both Chloe and Fairly Otter, which also duplicated the sharing thing from season 10. We've even done the character leaves for college's exposition setup through the prior spin-off. There's barely a new bone in this show's body. What else is there to tell or see or say or do that hasn't been covered in 185 episodes of prior art? That is the question The Fairly OddParents: A New Wish needs to answer for itself. And it's a pretty existential question. Why do you exist as a show? Obviously, there's the angle that it's a guileless cash grab, that's a given, but what is your creative justification? It's not that you're a new story, because you're effectively a reboot. It's not that you're exploring some untold piece of the prior universe, because, again, we've had plenty of time to cover everything already. So aside from the answer that it was a safe, unchallenging development choice for Brian Robbins to put money behind that he actually didn't have to really think about, can this cartoon make any case for itself to stand on its own, to convincingly rebuke the perception that it's perhaps one of the most useless reboots in kids' TV? It'll have to make that case pretty quickly. Let's watch the show's first episodes and find out. The show's opening episode, simply titled Fly, notably takes a different, slower tack to proceedings, simplifying the original concept down to a smaller scale, both figuratively and literally here, as it balances both introducing the premise and our cast with the wishing adventures we're more used to. It's very reminiscent of the Rugrats reboot in that regard. Hazel's having a hard time after moving into the city and still deeply misses her brother. She wishes she could just fly to see him, which inadvertently triggers the fairy godparents next door, trying to keep the illusion of normal lives into a wild goose chase to return their neighbor's kid back to normal. From a story standpoint, the episode is well told and manages to avoid directly retreading anything that may have already been covered 2 decades ago. Hazel is her own flavor of eccentric in a way that helps her carry the show on her own. I really like what I've seen of her so far. Her parents are a strong supporting cast, rightly making the choice to trash the tired classic sitcom dynamics of Timmy's parents for more realistic and nuanced execution here. And it also goes to show that there doesn't have to be the kind of incompetence the original series presented for someone to still be having a rough go of things, which I think is an important thing to subtly say. The fairy pair are pretty much the same as they've always been, probably the one part of this show that I won't dispute going unchanged. The moralizing is a touch direct in this episode, maybe show don't tell next time, but it's not necessarily heavy-handed. Episode 2, The Department of Magical Violations, pulls the show into a wildly different direction I wasn't expecting to see from them this early. Jorgen von Strangle returns into the picture, and given Cosmo and Wanda weren't officially assigned, they're put through a grueling test to see if they can work together, or else Hazel will be paired with an overbearing fairy who seems to know exactly what a kid wants. But is any of that really what Hazel wants? The show introduced Fairy World briefly at the end of the first episode, but I feel like bringing in Jorgen to lay down the law here was a bit too much too soon. The pacing on this feels a bit rushed, and despite being both the second episode in the production order and the broadcast order, it feels misplaced, and it doesn't feel representative of the kind of concept they set up in episode 1. That said, it does start to introduce the impression that story, and specifically a thorough narrative, is going to become a bigger part of this series than it was in the original, which is a bit of a different direction than the original show. I will give them credit for that. Despite the pacing issues, the plot beats themselves are well handled, and the strong conceptual bones to the premise of this episode are still evident in spite of the somewhat messy execution. Episode 3, Teacher's Pal, is more of a traditional feeling Fairly episode. Having trouble fitting in with the kids in the cafeteria, Hazel feels she might have more in common with the teachers, and makes a wish to become friends with them instead. However, when the teachers end up becoming increasingly more immature, and with a big test on the way, Hazel has to get things back in order. This third episode feels more in line with expectations, like it would have worked in 2004 just as well as it does now, but doesn't feel like it necessarily fully leans back into anything the old series did, which is welcome. Much like with the previous episode, it all feels much more grounded and coherent, with a more prevalent narrative through line that helps lay a strong foundation for a well-delivered creative execution. The pacing finds its groove, and there's a little more exposition along the way to boot. The show's CGI art style combines the stylistic influences of Fairly with the kind of design we saw in the Big Nate cartoon a few years ago. That very selectively lit visual language still holds up as a contrast to how kids' TV is usually styled, in both 2 and 3 dimensions, but as with Nate, it still doesn't feel like the right call for an episodic comedy. It does feel like the style has brightened up compared to Big Nate, but there are places where it still feels just as off here as it did on that show. The animation itself is very appealing. Tight and visually pacey, expressive when it needs to be, but restrained when flourish is unwarranted. Not that we have much of a bar for 2024 premieres when only 2 shows have aired, plus a third delayed from last year and a fourth delayed even longer, all from the same network, but it's certainly one of the best looking animation directions I've seen from a recent new series. Something worth waxing about for animation stans, assuming any of them are actually paying attention and haven't written Nick off while they love bombed on studio creations with high expectations. I do appreciate the show's mixed medium throws to 2D moments in the original Stephen Silver Butch Hartman art style, as perhaps most exemplified by the episode title cards, which would be perfect as a lead-in to an episode of the original series. Though that said, there were perhaps maybe a few too many meta-references to Timmy's adventures in the first episode. Not just callbacks, but even such a deep cut as having someone with the appearance of an older version of Timmy from one original episode portray a bus driver / movie extra at one point, which hurts any attempts for this to try and stand on its own. Later episodes do better on avoiding this, which is good progress, but it makes the callbacks in the first episode feel even more like needless pandering. Overall, The Fairly OddParents: A New Wish does try to put a new spin on the episodic, and goes for something a bit different to what the original series tried in a way they could make their own. It gives the show, potentially, a valid raison d'etre, if they keep doing it right. The show has a strong creative foundation, and much more of a commitment to narrative than the original series displayed. Sure, it is still a rehash of a tired franchise that, before this, was past its prime, and that already burnt the retool bridge a year ago. I don't want it to be that just because this reboot does well, executives get the wrong idea and they just shovel on more bad reboots upon us, because apparently that's what we want, because this one was actually pretty good. But New Wish is battling successfully, or at least convincingly, in a fight that so many other rehashes have failed at, providing a compelling answer to the question, why does this exist? Conducting itself in such a way that it begins to shut down that question entirely. There's definitely been a lot of effort and a lot of love put into this by the creators behind this show, and it shows in the high quality of the fun and enjoyable product they've made. I still wish those talents were applied to giving a truly original story a chance to shine instead. Another one, given we've already had rock, paper, scissors. There are still ways the money that went to this could have been better spent. Do we really need to give Butch a stable paycheck for a called-in favor and Brian some productivity theater for shareholders? Or pan out that god-awful Netflix deal through the international rights that has already been ruinous to several shows as it is? But for once, those kinds of thoughts are beside the point. The Fairly OddParents: A New Wish shows real promise as a show, and not just a cash grab, and it begins to make a case for itself as more than just another reboot. And maybe, over the course of its 20-episode run, it'll prove that finding a creative purpose outside of the nostalgia and the boardroom isn't just wishful thinking after all. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more new show reviews like this. And I can't talk about original storytelling in 2024 without talking about Nick's other new show, Rock, Paper, Scissors, which I reviewed up here or down in the description. And you can support these videos directly for as little as $3 a month through my Patreon or YouTube memberships linked at benchday.tk/join. I'll see you next time.